One of the most profound questions asked by anthropologists concerns the relationship between language and culture. We know that culture influences language. Language is learned through social contact, and many of the meanings language expresses derive from the social contexts in which they are uttered. Linguistic anthropologists study culture through language and language through culture. They use ethnography to study the relations between language, culture, and individuals, looking specifically at discursive practices, communicative practices, and as always, at sociocultural, historical, political, and economic contexts that shape language use. My colleague, Dr. Leighton Peterson, is a linguistic anthropologist and filmmaker. He produced the film Columbus Day Legacy, which we've already seen. His work in linguistic anthropology started out when he worked with Navajo radio broadcasters, looking at the ways Navajo is spoken on the air. And in fact, the manager of the station asked him to investigate why listeners were always complaining about the ways Navajo was being spoken on the radio. Dr. Peterson completed this study for his master's thesis. The experience fueled his lifelong interest in linguistic anthropology. He found that it was the requirements and formats of commercial radio that forced announcers, who were often translating from written English directly into Navajo live on the radio. The format of the 15-second and 30-second advertisements required them to shorten up the Navajo or to speak English. The station also wanted everybody in the Navajo community to be able to understand what was being said on the radio. This meant that, say, a 90-year-old Navajo grandmother who did not speak English could understand the news being translated from the Associated Press wire. But they also had to ensure that a 20 or 30-year-old Navajo, whose vocabulary was much more limited, could understand as well. And again, all of this was done on fast-paced commercial radio. That was Dr. Peterson's first project, looking at how language relates to culture, looking at how the context and specifics of a cultural frame or cultural setting impact language use. And that is, in a sense, what linguistic anthropology is about, looking at how language is used, how culture is reflected in language, and how language is reflected in culture. By the end of this module, you should be able to identify and describe key anthropological perspectives, including linguistic relativity, speech acts, ethnography of speaking, communicative practice, language ideologies, language stratification, mock Spanish, and AAVE or Ebonics. Explain language and communication as dynamic processes that reflect and recreate culture, identity, power, and inequality within and among social groups. Utilize anthropological perspectives to reflect on and think critically about language, communication, and identity in the world around you. There are 4 film clips to get us started. These look at language variety in the U.S. Stephen Willis is a poetry slam artist and performs Ebonics 101, in which he draws on multiple forms of English to introduce slang or Ebonics or African American Vernacular English, AAVE, both to speak of the Black experience and to suggest that AAVE is a rich, full-fledged language on its own. In a TEDx talk honoring Spanglish as resource, Eric Johnson defined Spanglish not as the Adam Sandler comedy, but as a form of communication used by bilingual Spanish-English speakers. He also argues that Spanglish is a linguistically sound form of communication. A key notion Johnson introduces here is that of code switching, which we'll discuss further in this module. After the negative portraits of white trash in Module 5 on class, this clip, Appalachian English, from the Language and Life Project, is more of a celebration of Appalachian culture, identity, and the linguistic creativity of what people call mountain talk. In linguist and cultural preservationist, Native American linguist Darrell Baldwin, who runs the Miamia Center at Miami University, speaks of his commitment to revitalizing Miami language and cultural heritage. After you view these clips, you'll participate in a discussion on Canvas with your colleagues. There's a single presentation in this module, Language and Diversity, divided into two parts. Part 1 looks at language and immigration issues in Arizona and then defines language and explores the relation between language and culture before turning to language and diversity in the United States, including a discussion of Native American languages. Part 2 presents language and power, language and gender, language and class, code switching, African American vernacular English, mock Spanish, distinct from Spanglish, language and vitalization, the disappearance of indigenous language, language revitalization, and the proliferation of new forms of digital communication. These presentations are followed by a quiz. There are two sets of readings in this module. The first, on language and culture, consists of 3 readings. In To Give Up on Words, Silence in Western Apache Culture, linguistic anthropologist Keith Basso looks at the important cultural role played by silence among the Apache. Silence operates in vital areas of life, which Apache understand, but that are hard for many Americans who are uncomfortable with silence to grasp. Jane Hill's Language, Race, and White Public Space writes about language tensions between English speakers and Spanish speakers and how many whites insist that Spanish speakers speak English while whites themselves use what Hill calls mock Spanish to enforce racial hierarchy. In the third reading, Trigger Happy with Gunspeak, Robert Myers looks satirically but also critically at the ubiquity of gun metaphors in U.S. communicative practice. As I see it, Myers really hits the bullseye here. These readings are followed by a first set of study questions in Canvas. The second set of readings is Chapter 4, Disability from Renegade Dreams. In this chapter, Ralph considers the lives of former gang members who've been confined to wheelchairs due to gun violence. Some of these men have become activists trying to steer other Chicago youth away from gang life and gun violence. In this chapter, Ralph also underlines the intersection of race and socioeconomic status with disabled communities. After reading this chapter, please respond to study questions 2. In the next module, Module 9, we turn to religion and religious diversity in the United States.